Today I'm speaking to an author of two books, and we're going to focus in on one of these books, which is so fascinating. And before we get into even the book title, please, Mark, tell us, who are you?
So my name is Mark Forman. I am a licensed psychologist in the state of California, and I've been working for about 20 years with families, children, adult individuals, and adult couples. Although the work that I did with children was more in the first half of those 20 years. I am also an author of a book called A Guide to Integral Psychotherapy, which is about translating Ken Wilber's philosophy into practical application. And the book that I just published is a different kind of book, and it's called The Monster's Journey from Trauma to Connection. And it is basically a comparison of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, but for a person who has been traumatized early in life. So I take Joseph Campbell's stages and I suggest that there's probably a path or journey for early trauma, and the stages are somewhat like, but somewhat different than Joseph Campbell's stages. And so I talk about that. I talk about my own personal story in the book, and then talk just about recovery in general, what it means to recover from trauma, and some of the very many steps you could take, and very many different kinds of healing practices that you could engage to help with an aspect of your trauma.
So what was your kind of guiding motivation or the purpose for writing this book?
I would say that the initial motivation was that I spent a lot of time in meditation communities when I was in my late teens, and I had some real depression, and that was one way that I chose to try to help the depression. And I was looking around me, and I was often the youngest person in the room, and in a room of 1,500 people, so in these very, very large events. And I just sort of had a budding intuition that this was somehow harder for me than it was for other people. They didn't seem to be straining to go through the program, to sit all the minutes in quiet. It's certainly not that any meditation retreat is always light and easy, but I had the experience that when I went, it seemed very hard. And just from that inkling, I think I got the idea that something is different, but I don't know what it is. And for years after that, as I continued to meditate and went into therapy, I proceeded with this sense of feeling different, and it never left me. I even thought, okay, maybe I'm just an Enneagram 4. If your audience is familiar with the Enneagram, I was just popped out an individualist, and therefore I'm moodier and so forth. And actually, that could be part of the reason, but I still felt like things were harder. And so as I proceeded up in years and such, I started to get more and newer and sometimes more intense mental health symptoms than I even got when I was a young teenager. And at that point, I felt like, okay, something is not right here because I'm getting anxiety. Now I have huge anxiety, whereas before I had huge depression, and it didn't feel like I was naturally just an anxious person. So it finally dawned on me after a very long time, I might be sort of having a post-traumatic stress like reaction to things in my life where everything seems catastrophic and nothing gets better. And based on that sort of second, more kind of tangible insight, I went into trauma therapy. And this book is really an outcome of the 3 years, 2 to 3 years I spent in trauma therapy, and how that forced me to rethink my psychology in ways that I just hadn't anticipated. I never thought of myself that way and was not that interested in models of trauma in my therapeutic practice. I mean, I certainly had people with trauma as clients, but it had never been my subject. And now it felt like it had to be for personal reasons.
So, I mean, the title of the book is very striking, The Monster's Journey. And of course, I think we're fascinated by the villains in the stories. We're fascinated by heroes, but villains sometimes have even more appeal. I mean, the recent movie The Joker is an example that everyone's been ranting and raving about, because the villain, it's almost impossible to even tell, is he a villain or is he a hero? It's like he's like almost like a blend of the two. But my question is really like, how do you define monster in this case?
Yeah, so the idea of the book, as I mentioned briefly, is that there's this separate journey that people who have early trauma take or must take in order to recover. And so the term that I use to describe these folks with early trauma, and myself included, would be the monster, or so the monster's journey. And essentially what that is it's some way that early trauma survivors either feel about themselves or fear about themselves that they might become monstrous if life does not change in a particular way. And why does this happen? Well, or where does one get the sense that I am a monster? So little children do not have the ability to step back out of a situation and say something like, boy, my father really hit me today. He's a man with a lot of problems. And I know that I'm a good kid and I didn't deserve that, what happened to me today. That's a level of sophistication of thinking that children don't have, and really even teenagers are the ones who struggle to start to manifest those kinds of thoughts where they assign responsibility where it's supposed to be, and they don't attack themselves because bad things happen. But young children can say, bad things are happening and it must have something to do with me. I must have caused it or contributed to it. And sometimes the parent or the abuser actually will say that. They will use words. Well, if you were just cleaner at the table, I wouldn't have hit you. So they'll add to this belief that the child starts to grow, which is they're the problem. And if that belief stretches out over a long period of time, there's no positive adult who can kind of redirect the child, then the child ends up with this internal feeling of self-loathing, more or less. And they feel that they are like a monster. They may use different terms for it, but this is the one that I found touches on an aspect for most people. It is a provocative term. It's not meant to be saying you're a monster, like you're a horrible person. It's more like you probably believe that you're a monster, and how can we help you connect again to the normal world, which you didn't get a good chance to do, because as soon as you were trying to grow and work your way in the normal world, you had these traumas or events that interrupted your growth.
So, how much, please tell us about, how much you're willing to share about some of the key milestones of the monster's journey. Of course, don't give the book away here, but, give us some, like, at least inklings as to what might that journey be like.
Yes, so good question. So a basic way to talk about it is Joseph Campbell came up with this idea of the hero's journey, which is about the normal person's journey towards self-growth. So the normal person is in their village or society, they're fairly comfortable, and nothing is wrong on the surface or whatnot. Then they get what's called a call to adventure. Something goes wrong. Maybe there's a new magical beast roaming the hills and everybody's scared, or they have to embark on some great journey. So Frodo from the Lord of the Rings would be a perfect example of a hero. He starts out very normal at the beginning of the movie, and by the end, he's been transformed. So this part of the journey Campbell called initiation, separation or departure, leaving one's home to go be initiated into the magic of the world. So the hero meets a guide. Very often there's the learning of magic or some kind of powers that the hero will have to use to slay a foe or a monster of all things, because monsters were used a different way in these older myths. So the hero goes out by defeating the monster or whatever the obstacle is. That completes the initiation portion of the journey. And then the hero is called to return back home to his or her home culture with blessings. And those are normally symbolized as, like, you slay the dragon and you have all these riches that you'll bring back. But Campbell really thinks that it's symbolic for people who undergo a spiritual transformation and then bring that wisdom back with them to their village or tribe. So essentially, there's a very similar structure of those three simple stages with the monster. There's a departure or separation when the monster undergoes the trauma. Then eventually there's an initiation where the monster later will meet a healer who will try to help them begin to connect to the normal world. And then there is a return portion where the monster or the person who thinks they're a monster actually can fully integrate in the normal world in an engaged way, and that they can give their gifts, because trauma often bestows gifts onto the normal world. So they're also doing this separation, initiation, and return. Now, in the book, we break down each of these stages, and there are sub stages and steps along the way, both in Campbell's work, but also in the monster journey. So what I gave is probably the simplest overview that we could take.
What immediately comes to mind is one of the first movies that I ever saw was Conan, the movie, and there's a famous scene of Conan versus the ape man in a hall of mirrors, and where Conan has to defeat the ape man, and then there is the jewel in the middle of the room that even there is a wizard that comes back from behind the mirrors who tries to grab the jewel, but he kind of disappears in a sort of like enlightenment process. But really that jewel is sort of symbolical of Conan's reconnection with his own inner feminine, because in the scene, the feminine, the princess that he saves, awakens. Okay, so these kind of like symbols all kind of came through as you were saying. But it's interesting that the monster in that process also disappears, right? So in that sense, that monster has kind of healed itself because it kind of wasn't necessary afterwards, let's say, after the kind of healing process has finished. So what kind of people would you reckon the book would be very beneficial for to read?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And there are lots of very interesting movies, some of which portray people literally with early trauma, when they're children, and they'll flash back to that point in the protagonist's life. Then you get stories which sometimes are a bit more mixed. I mean, Conan the Barbarian is interesting because I believe his mother is killed, and then he is taken, and it's really, he's turned into, he pushes a wheel, if I have that right, that either powers the granary or the water supply.
Yeah, there is that element to it.
Yeah, and they show him becoming more and more powerful, his body. That's how he gains his physical strength. So in some way, you could suggest Conan is a trauma survivor, more or less. And then, he sort of mixed with the hero's journey, slays his, it's the person, I think it's James Earl Jones, who was the leader of this cult, and the reason that Conan was orphaned. But this kind of narrative where we get this complex hero who's kind of a little bit of an anti-hero is a new one. So in terms of who the book fits for, or who the monster journey fits for, the way we try to do that in the book is talk about what are called ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. So there are 10 that they typically list. And just to briefly go over, that would be childhood physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, which means your parents are not at all paying attention. Then there's having been abandoned, having a parent who's mentally ill, having a parent who's substance abusing, having domestic violence in the house, and then they add a divorce or separation, which is probably the least serious of those categories, but can be very difficult depending on how the divorce is carried out. And so what I suggest is in the book is we go through this ACEs research and we connect it with what happens. So the more categories of these adverse childhood experiences that a person has, so not only physical abuse, but also sexual abuse, also abandonment, etc., the more numbers that and the boxes they check, the more challenging the later life outcomes are. So more physical health disease, more addiction, more mental health like depression or suicide attempts, etc. And there seems to be a kind of spot that is important where people who have 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences seem to kind of step over a line into where these challenging outcomes happen later in life. And so what I have the reader do is I present the checklist in the book, talk about what it means, and then have people literally go through and check the boxes and see if they've had these adverse childhood experiences. If they do, and they have 3, 4, 5 of them, then I'm making the connection that that's probably where we're going to see people taking the monster's journey, because then they've had a really chaotic childhood. Now, a person could have only one of these experiences. Let's say sexual abuse is the only one. If it was severe enough, it might be enough to change a person's psyche so they operate like the monster. On the other hand, some people might have multiple ACEs and they seem to be resilient and don't develop trauma. And that may have something to do with genes, and it may have something to do with getting some social support at the time of the trauma. So most child trauma survivors, there's no rescue figure in their lives when they're a child, because the parents are often perpetrating or enabling the abuse or whatever is happening. So who's there to rescue? Sometimes there's a grandparent or an uncle, an aunt, etc. But normally kids just are sort of baking in this traumatic environment until they get older. And so that's a risk factor for this monster's journey, is you kind of, it's all in your head, all the thoughts and feelings that you have, and they start to change you into this monster persona where you feel like you're different and alienated from everybody else.
I must say that at this point, I always knew this conversation was going to be quite difficult to get through for me, because I haven't really, from the list that you've given, I don't think I've been through a single one of them. Maybe just a little bit, but like sometimes you feel a little bit neglected by parents. Like, why did they leave me at home for half an hour while they went something? It's not a big deal, but I do feel for people who have gone through this, and I have some personal friends, and considering that I'm originally from Bosnia, Bosnia has been through a huge war. You know, I've spent 3 years in war. I know lots of people who've been through physical, mental, and sexual abuse, not necessarily as children, but in a similar sort of sometimes similar outcomes can happen. I suppose sometimes people can turn potentially into monsters. And I know of certain people who've turned into monsters themselves after, for example, their family has been killed in Bosnia. There's cases of people who've had 7, 8, 9 people killed in their family, and they just kind of went, just give me a gun, I'm just going to go and sort of like sacrifice myself, right? I don't care, like my life is not worth living anymore. So I have to breathe into this a little bit just for a second. And the next question is then really, how is the book perhaps capable of helping people who tick a lot of those boxes, the monsters? Is it capable of guiding them towards that gem at the end of the journey?
So you mentioned a very important point, which is this, this ACEs checklist was really how the field of trauma studies got started in a more formal way. But there are certain things they didn't include, like bullying as a child or war as just a reality. And I talk about war very briefly in the book a couple of times, because some of my clients have been Persian, for example, or Iranian. And, if they're old enough, they went through a war. That would be an example that I've seen. And it's very clear that that impacts them significantly, as it would anybody. This book can name the situation that they're in, and there's a power to naming that.
Yeah.
But I haven't, there are people who specialize in war trauma because it's a very unique, in what others, I might see a client whose father abandoned him or whose mother died prematurely. I would not typically see a family where 8 out of 9 members had been killed intentionally in a war. So I would almost hold it as a question. It would be, is this worldview or is this sort of idea potent enough to help people on that level? Or would you need something else? Would you need to write a book exclusively about war trauma or torture or some of those categories? And to be honest, this book, even though the ideas are very specific, it feels like the book is aiming to start a certain kind of conversation about trauma. And my hope is that people will take it and apply it and critique it if it doesn't fit, completely for them. And my hope would be somebody who works in that field, working with war survivors, would be able to tell me where it works and where it doesn't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And what I think is, certainly for me on my journey, perhaps in some sense I was a monster, but in like a kind of subconscious way that I never really, and again, this is a kind of self-identification, right? That kind of monster perhaps sits within you and you can never sort of put a finger on it until you really sit and go like, well, who am I? That's why my opening question is, who are you? Right? And it's almost like a little trick question, but it's also like it's like, well, let's connect on the deepest level we possibly can in this conversation. And so uh, I certainly did self-identify that I had some sort of level of PTSD from the war. But because, again, in the war, you have this situation where, because everyone else in the country has been through the war, they start doing this ego comparison thing, which is like, oh, what happened to you? And they said, well, I became a refugee. I was sleeping rough for, a couple of months, whatever. And then, we got to somewhere else and so on. It's like, oh, that's nothing. We had 3 family members killed. And then they go, oh, that's nothing. We had 7 killed. And it's like, well, we actually had 20 in our greater family, and we were in a bit of concentration camp as well. So the people start kind of like ego comparisоning on the dark side, right? Who's been through most amount of ordeal. And I suppose what your book is about is saying, hold on a second, identify that you have been affected greatly by these kind of events and circumstances, and understand that you've got the way out. There is a way out, and you may most likely need help from a guide, a healer, a couple of healers, who knows, like a change in context, circumstances, all that kind of stuff, ability to change, to love yourself more, to actually really connect. And that's really the next thing I want to ask you about is, what does it mean to connect? Because the subtitle of the book is From Trauma to Connection. What are we connecting with? Let's say I'm a monster, what am I connecting with?
Yes. So, first of all, just to say, if anybody told me they had been in a war zone, I would ask a lot of questions, if they were comfortable answering, I guess I would say. Because absolutely one could be traumatized, even if you didn't get the worst things happening to you. It might just be just a set of very bad things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were homeless for a little while, okay, that during a time of war, that could have a traumatic effect. On the other hand, maybe it didn't, but it's worth it to discuss. So I would just say that much about, war traumas you would want to ask. I'm sorry, what was the
So
last question?
what are we connecting after trauma? What are we connecting with?
So, yeah, so the trauma itself, and if it changes us to this sort of monster identity, it cuts us off in 2 ways. One, it causes us to cut off from other people because we feel that we are so different or broken that it makes connecting with loved ones or people in our lives much more difficult. Vulnerability is more difficult, relationships are more difficult, and so forth. And also, the trauma disconnects us from the outer world. The outer world seems this untrustworthy place where we must push ourselves to stay involved. So a simple example is a child going to school. Let's imagine this child is being beat when he comes home from school most days. How is he supposed to care about his schoolwork? What does it really mean? Now, he might like being at school because at school, at least, he's not being beat. But chances are his motivation is zero because it's not as important as what's happening to him. So he's disconnected from life. And as he grows older, or she grows older, uh, he or she will be disconnected from the normal things that make life worth living, you know, and normal kinds of happiness, simple sorts of pleasures, you know, the pleasure of just relating to people, person to person. And so the vision of the monster's journey is if you recognize you're on it and you start to then move through the stages, eventually you will make a stronger connection with the normal world, as well as a stronger connection with what I call the true self, which just means what you might have been like if none of this had happened. So you've got some basic personality in you that was kind of there when you were born. And if you didn't get traumatized, what would that personality be like? It would probably be more open, more peaceful, more joyful, more free. And you have to dig within yourself to find that and connect to that part of yourself um, that was untouched by the trauma. And that may be buried beneath many, many layers of feelings and defenses. But when you can touch that part of yourself and you can participate in the outer world, then you are connected. You're no longer this monster roaming around trying to hide, most likely. You sort of become, you've come back to the world in a special kind of way.
So the other thing, it's this kind of monster narrative brings about a lot of situations and stories where it's where monsters are present. And I suppose the important thing to outline here is that monsters aren't necessarily scary looking things here. And recent case has been of the documentary that came out with Paris Hilton, and she actually said, and I'm quoting here, that she helped create a monster by being first influencer and going through childhood trauma of being beaten and abused in what's the school the where they stay over at night and so on, boarding school, where they get systematically abused and sort of overly put through set of rules that they don't really want to follow. And of course, Paris Hilton, at the face of it, is a very beautiful girl who is successful, got lots of money. She's got everything she needs, but deep inside, she's hurting. So tell me a little bit about the types of monsters that exist. And also the other story that came to mind was Monsters, Inc. Perhaps the Monsters, Inc. is from Pixar, is a narrative of different types of monsters that exist and how they between themselves also interact, similar to what I was saying earlier on about the whenever I'm in a company of Bosnian people, it usually I kind of sometimes time it, but it takes about 15 minutes before somebody brings about a war story. Right. And then the rest of the evening is like, yeah, but we went through this and they just relive the kind of trauma years. Right. So that war keeps going on in people's head. So tell me a little bit about different types of monsters that might exist. And is there maybe even templates or archetypal monsters?
So people are, using the word monster in lots of different ways. So the old-fashioned, what we would call archetype of the monster, meaning the old-fashioned idea or pattern, was that something has gone wrong with society, or something has gone wrong with the individual, and there's a monster, and the monster is causing this, and someone has to go out and slay the monster, and then society will be brought back to its normal positive state. That's the traditional role of the monster, and that type of narrative works really well, and makes for a good movie, and is very compelling, and there's still heroes' journeys to take in the world. Sometimes it's the monster represents more of what has gone wrong in an individual, like I have a dark side, might be a way to say it, and then they try to slay their own dark side. But that's different from how I'm using the word monster here. It's more like I've been changed into a monster, and I'm not trying to slay the monster in me. I'm trying to understand him or her, because it represents a part of where I've been and a part of how I see the world. And so it's a little bit, it gives this twist where the monster is really part of us, or one of us, and wants what we want. There's a good example from a recent Stephen King movie called Super 8, which was about an alien who had been captured by the military. Now, at first, it appears that the alien is this destructive force who wants to get out of the military's control, and apparently wants to wreak havoc and hurt people. But the children in the story, who are sort of the protagonists, slowly discover this sort of mystery about this monster, that it was a monster who was captured. And what the monster's really looking for are the pieces of material and equipment that would help it rebuild its spaceship and get home. And there's this very powerful moment where the children confront this monster, and you can see in the monster's eyes that it's not wanting to hurt. And I believe, if I have the memory of the movie right, it even telepathically communicates to the children, that it's not wanting to harm, it just wants to go home. So we see the use of the monster in so many new ways in our modern culture. And I think the book is trying to pick out one use of that term, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't go to, some horror movie with some evil being and say, oh, that man's like a monster. But that would be a different usage of the word. We're not usually talking about people's healing, if they're serial killers with chainsaws in the movies, that kind of thing. So we might call this like a sort of meta modern situation, meaning modern or postmodern, or postmodern, meaning all the different ways that artists are communicating during this period. Someone who I was studying wrote an article about Buffy the Vampire Slayer as a television show that uses monsters in all kinds of ways. Sometimes they're the enemy, sometimes they're the helpers. Sometimes they're on your side, sometimes they play a different role altogether, and playing with those artistic concepts. But I say the monster's journey is this very specific thing And in the book, we actually work through a couple of other books to see the patterns. So we take a book like White Fang by Jack London, which is a very famous novel, and we see the monster's journey there. And we see that in that case, the White Fang, who's a protagonist, succumbs a lot to anger. So different monsters can succumb to more anger, or they might succumb to what we call dissociation, which is sort of floating away. They may fawn over other people, which is try to lower themselves to another powerful person to make them feel worthy and safe. So there are several variations of how monsters react in according to the monster's journey idea. Um, mhm.
So is the monster then in your use of the word monster, do you think of that as like a persona on top of the ego, or is it like kind of that's how the ego is developed and now needs to kind of shape shift, almost like you're going to reconfigure your mind to rethink yourself, or is it like, can it be also a persona and so on? Talk to a little bit about that, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good question. I see it as the the monster is something that the ego becomes. There's no separation between the persona and the self, or the persona and the sort of true ego, because this is happening to small children typically. And so their ego becomes all about what is wrong with them and what is scary in the world, or in other people. And the healing, therefore, requires that they have to start over a bit from scratch and discover a new self that isn't so colored by the trauma and the traumatized ego. And that is definitely one of the most difficult things about trauma recovery. I remember thinking in my own trauma therapy, wow, have I ever had a thought, that I can remember that wasn't influenced by my traumatic beliefs that I grew up with. Um, and I had managed to appear somewhat normal to people who didn't know me that well. But the more people knew me, I mean, the stranger I was. Um, so yeah, I look at it as a transformation of the ego that's involuntary and that happens at an early age. Um, and then to heal is to begin again. Um,
Yeah.
Although, because it can we don't have to relive literally every step of childhood. Our adult capacities can help us, but we have to find this new self again, our true self.
And I've dealt at least with two people in my own program, which is called Fresh Mind, which is really about clearing these mental, what we call impurities, things that are really not serving you, things that you haven't really dealt with, and more you find them. It's basically from the integral theory, the clearing up process. But we take people through all the stages of spiral dynamics and all the intelligences, and then really identify the impurities at all stages and help them clear through that. But in a couple of cases of people that think of themselves as monsters without ever uttering that, it's like an unthought known, basically. I try to help them to say, well, look, your life for, let's say, past 10, even 20 years has been likely, and they would say it's been pretty good, it's been very good, but they're still affected by that early stage trauma. So what are some of the, basically, let's say, one or two tips for people who are reconstructing their ego from monster to whatever is the opposite of monster? Let's say, uh, what would you say?
So I think, two tips. One would be, see if you can find a healing practice, just one even to begin, that you can engage in. And that can be a lot of things. So that could be individual therapy, a bit more traditional. It could be forms of body work that are like massage based, or are based on movement. So there's a popular trauma therapy called somatic experiencing, which is about, well, the idea is the trauma gets stored in the body, and the somatic experiencing session allows the person to move or make sounds or shake that release this pent up energy. And so people quite like it, and it's not as verbal or memory orientated. You don't really need to remember what the trauma is. So having a healing practice is just a very good thing. And my experience is, the more severe the trauma, the more healing practices you will need to do over time. It doesn't mean you need to do them all at once. And of course, how much you need to do depends on how severe your reactions are. Some people are having very powerful reactions to trauma, even as adults. Other people, it's more mild, and so you have to do your best to take stock of where you are at. I think in terms of a second tip, let me think about this for a second. I would say that a second thing you can do is talk to trusted family members about things that have happened in the past. And the idea would be, to try to gather some information on your trauma, especially if you don't really know the whole story. So a lot of people have only partial memories, and they're not sure what was really going on. And if you're an adult now, you might have that conversation with an aunt or an uncle, and they can fill in for you what happened. And it sounds like an awkward conversation, but typically family members want to share because they've been carrying these secrets and these burdens in them, and they want to share more. I actually just had a conversation with one of my uncles, who I was in some touch with, but who had read the book, and he said, "Hey, I want to talk to you." And he filled in some things about what was happening when I was a child. So my father, when I was a child, went psychotic for several years, and that was sort of my initial trauma, and ended with abandonment. But so there was a lot of information I didn't know. And while I was writing the book, my mother filled me in on things that she'd never told me. And now that I'd written the book, my uncle had shared things that he never told me. And so now I have an even more complete picture. And that's just helpful because the less we imagine, we tend to imagine bizarre things or scary things, sometimes worse than actually happened. So when we get that information about the real events, that helps us put the puzzle pieces together. Um, so I would say try to have some of those conversations if you can.
Yeah, in my experience, this kind of like when people find out the facts of what happened, they connect to reality, and that reality tends to be curative. It cures them of these often what are even worse kind of fantasies of what's happened. And maybe they're not worse, but if you're having 12 different ideas of what might have happened and they're all terrible, they all add up to worse thing than what actually happened. so so it's kind of like, it's almost like the brain and the mind are doing some sort of mathematics there and going like, oh, it's really terrible. It was like, and it's like recently I wrote this little set of instructions for my children because I'm doing the work and they're off school at the moment, and in their minds, they're making it up that like everything that I ask of them is really terrible. And then so I sat down and said like, okay, guys, look, sit down here. Let's see what I'm actually asking you. And I said, you wake up on time, you brush your teeth, you make your bed up, you put your pajama away, you have your breakfast, you do a little bit of reading, and then you can game, something like that. And they're like, is that fair? And they're like, oh, that's fine. That's not bad. But like when we're just chit chatting about it, it sounds like, gosh, this is so terrible. And so the mind has this effect on causing us to feel worse than it actually was in reality. Mark, I really appreciate you talking to me about the book. Just tell a little bit to the listeners, where they can find you, and we'll link to the book both on Amazon and any other places where you would prefer people to buy it, maybe some direct source, and also to review the book, give it good reviews on Amazon and so on. But are you looking for any particular people in your coaching and therapy practice, because you're obviously a qualified therapist as well?
Yes. Briefly, though, I would say sometimes what happened is as bad as you remember it. But you want to know the facts. You don't want to have an imagined version. You want to actually hear, okay, yeah, that was really as bad as I remember it. Sometimes it's not, like you're saying, but my idea is you want to find that out, with as tangible facts as you can. I am ongoingly taking new clients, coaching clients, and psychotherapy. People can go to my website, drmarkforman.com, and that'll talk about the practices that I do, the services, and they'll have the email address where you can contact me directly. You can find out more about the book if you Google The Monster's Journey, Mark Forman, into Amazon. There's a Kindle edition and a paperback edition. And so just really encouraging people to check out the book, look at the book preview. If it draws you in, maybe take that next step and purchase it. If you do, it's always lovely to have people write Amazon reviews if they enjoyed the book. That would be about it in terms of the things, in terms of connecting with me and connecting with what I'm doing. I have other projects and initiatives, but too much plugging can get a little confusing.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it, and total respect to you also for going through your own journey and coming out of that in the process, and not just kind of going like, yes, I made it or whatever, but actually sharing the narrative in a structured way. Currently, I'm also writing a couple of books, and the process itself is quite testing, right? It's a testing process. Like to finish a book is a big deal. So I applaud you and congratulate you and thank you, and massive respect to you. And I think I'm going to be getting the book myself to just better understand, maybe even my own checklist, as you mentioned. Who knows, I might have some, as I read the book, I might go like, oh, actually there's some other things I haven't really addressed. But also just to be more cognizant that, because what we find is that some other people, we might not be the monster, but the other person is, whether they know it or not. And so the better we understand their journey, quite literally, the better we're actually able to live. Maybe your neighbor is a monster. Okay, and you can't move house. So the better you understand him or her, the better your life is going to be. It's something like that. So the book might be relevant to those kind of people too. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, and I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason, for having me on. It was a total pleasure. I really enjoyed your questions.
Thank you.